Well, thank you, and great to be able to join and offer some information on the New Zealand experience with going to a proportional representation. And let's say, at the outset, it can be quite a scary prospect for major parties. It certainly was for me when I was the deputy leader of the opposition, and the two referendums on it were held in New Zealand. And then, of course, becoming leader of the opposition, I had to help reshape Labour to compete within the new environment. So it's not surprising that major party leaders often feel, do we really need to do this? So let's just go through a little bit of the background and context to it in the New Zealand experience and where it's led us to today. If you go back to the 50s and 60s, there was a third party in New Zealand which very occasionally got a seat in Parliament called Social Credit. And Social Credit was capable of scoring up to 20% of the vote, but getting one seat in an 80 or so member Parliament. And of course, there was a sense of great injustice about that from its supporters. But they were a small party, so they were never going to carry the day. I think a bit of the turning of the tide in public mood began in the 1978 and 1981 election aftermaths. In those two elections, the New Zealand Labour Party polled more votes than the Conservatives, the National Party, but won fewer seats. So Labour people started thinking, this isn't fair. Now, of course, the following election, 1984, Labour won, and won quite well, and it won a majority and won quite well again in 1987. So the issue went away for Labour. And I think often when major parties hold out against proportional representation, it's because they think just one more heave, one more heave and we'll get the majority that we've been wanting. But then, frankly, with a large majority like that, also single party governments are often empowered to do things which they haven't been very frank with the electorate about. And that was certainly the case with New Zealand Labour. And by the time it limped out of office in 1990, there was a great feeling of distrust because of the program of privatisations in particular, and people feeling that they hadn't really voted for what they got. So they voted for the Conservatives, who had quite a soothing message. And hey presto, they came into power and accelerated what had been seen as the structural reform, neoliberalism agenda. And so even within a year of that 1990 election, people were completely fed up. They say you vote for one thing in this country and you get the opposite. Now, interestingly, in the 1990 election, the head of the Conservative Party, Jim Bolger, promised a referendum if elected. I think his party never forgave him for it, but he promised it. And true to his word, referenda were held. Now, interesting, and I think interesting to Labour sort of rethinking the history of Brexit, it was never the case that this was going to be decided on a single referendum. New Zealand started on a process, recognising the significance of this, because an electoral reform is at the core of constitutional reform. There were two referenda. 1992, people were asked two questions. The first one was, do you want to change the electoral system of New Zealand or not? A staggering 85% of people said they wanted to change the system. That shows you how fed up they were with everybody, with the Labour Party, the National Party, with everybody. So in that referendum, there was a second question, and it said, regardless of how you voted on the first question of whether you want change or not, if there were to be change, which of the following options would you like? And it put four options. One, I think you call in the UK alternative vote. It's preferential voting, as in the Australian lower house. That only got 6%. There was another option put called supplementary member, which got 5%. Single transferable vote, which is the Irish system and the way the Australian Senate is elected, got 16%. The mixed member proportional system, the German style system, which had had the main campaign around it, got 65%. 2/3 of Kiwi voters saying that's what we want. And so the undertaking from the indicative referendum that the government gave was that it would then draw up through the proper parliamentary processes an act of parliament for the majority or the greatest preferred system that came through this, and put that to the electorate in 1993. And so in 1993, there was quite a thorough process of drafting and consultation, and MPs did a study tour, I think, to Germany. So a fully developed Act of Parliament went to the 1993 referendum, which was also a general election year, so you're going to get a good turnout at that. Now, at that point, the referendum passed 54% to 46%. So you can see it came down quite significantly because the no campaign got quite a bit of traction, because again, people are always a bit concerned about change, but nonetheless, it passed 54 to 46 and it became law. Now, then, of course, each of the political parties had to try to position for the first MMP election in 1996. And this would be very relevant to such a transition for Britain's political parties. Now, I became leader of the Labour Party just after that election. And it was a very difficult transition, both for me as a new leader, but also because with the prospect of parties being able to be startups and get seats in Parliament, a lot of people were trying their luck. And so I could see elements of Labour support going all over the spectrum. Some of it was going to a party that positioned to the left of us, the Alliance. Some of it went to the New Zealand First Party, which is still in the Parliament today. You could say eclectic, nationalistic kind of party. Some of it actually went all the way across to the right of the Conservative Party. The people who had, for example, supported the main neoliberal thrust of the fourth Labour government. And there was another small party that also took some people. So my job was to try to reposition Labour as a coherent, mainstream social democratic party in this much broader spectrum of possibilities for party representation in the Parliament. And that first election was not easy. I mean, we got about 28%. New Zealand First did quite well, got almost half as much as we did. The party to the left of us, it did okay as well. Now, from that election, Labour could have led a government with the party to the left of it and the eclectic New Zealand First Party, but we went through 9 weeks of negotiation, as did the National Party, with the eclectic New Zealand First Party, and they decided to go with the National. And I always thought that actually in the long term, that worked better for us, because we didn't have the teething problems of being the first government under proportional representation and trying to make it work. And we learnt a lot from watching what happened as that coalition government actually broke up quite spectacularly. So I think it would be of interest to people to know how you do govern in this sort of system. Every election since 1996 under this new system has never delivered a single party majority government. Ironically, this one might. It might not, but this is probably one of the most realistic prospects for that happening. Because normally I think voters like to keep a bit of a check on the big parties. So there is a tendency to vote for small parties to keep that check. So the 9 years that I was Prime Minister, I always led a minority government. And particularly by the last term, I had to become quite inventive constitutionally to form that. So at the core of our government was always a coalition, and it was with the Alliance Party, which had positioned to the left of us. But as time went on, we developed support agreements called confidence and supply agreements with other parties that they would support us on our budget and other confidence measures. And that's what then gives the Governor-General, in your case, the Queen, the confidence that when a party leader goes to him or her and says, I can command a majority in Parliament, that you actually can. You can show those formal agreements. Now, what does this mean then for the kind of results you can get as a government? Some people will say it'll be completely paralysed by all the negotiation and nothing will ever happen. That is not my experience. My government was an extremely busy government, and it did some big and major reforms and big and major new initiatives. But what MMP, what proportional representation required us to do, was build up consultation mechanisms that we'd never been used to when we were a single party majority government in the past. And so ministers needed to know their counterparts in the support parties very well. The staff in their offices needed to know them very well. The party leaders needed to know each other very well. You needed to operate on a no surprises basis. And we actually put a new feature into the Cabinet Manual, which is the basis of cabinet government, I'm sure in the UK as in New Zealand, which had an agree to disagree provision. Because conventionally in Westminster style government, if someone doesn't agree with a majority decision of the cabinet, they leave the cabinet. Well, we said we can't have cabinets collapsing all the time just because a smaller party doesn't agree with something the major party wants to try and rally support for in the Parliament. So the agree to disagree procedure was set up. So, you know, even though I led for 9 years a minority coalition governments with this range of parties involved and range of agreements, we did provide stable government. No one thought the government was unstable because it had all these mechanisms for consultation and no surprises, which kept it that way. Now, one question you might ask is, how has this bedded down with the public? Does the public want change? Now, of course, going back to 1993, there were 46% of voters who in the end voted that they didn't want MMP. And in the 2008 election, as I recall, the National Party, the Conservatives, promised to hold another referendum on MMP to ask the people what they thought. Well, actually, in that referendum, the proportion of New Zealanders voting who supported MMP went up from 1993. So in 1993, it had been 54%. In the 2011 referendum, it was 58%. So, hey, go figure. Any of us would be very happy with 58% as a party vote. 58% is a clear majority. They were also asked a second question, which was, if a majority wanted change again, what would you change back to? Well, the old first past the post system came through, top of the pops there, as you would expect. But bottom line, you know, close to 60% of voters did not want it to change. Now, what about some of the myths around proportional representation? Some people say it gives power to extremists. That is not our experience in New Zealand. Actually, the balance, in a way, tends to be in the middle, as everywhere. Whether it's the German system between the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrat and their sister party, with sometimes the Free Democrats holding the balance. In Britain, we saw in the election where Labour was defeated at the end of Gordon Brown's term, the Liberal Democrats held a balance and they supported the Conservatives. I should say that up until the 2017 election, the largest party from the election always led the formation of the new government. The exception to that was 2017, where Jacinda Ardern and the Labour Party negotiated with the New Zealand First Party. And even though Labour had fewer votes, and quite significantly fewer than the National Party, New Zealand First elected to give Labour a chance. So that was an unusual outcome, but an entirely legitimate one under the system, because in the end, there's no point being the biggest party in the parliament if you don't have any friends to help you govern. And the National Party had put itself in that position. So rather than power going to the extremists, it tends to go a bit to more the middle of the road, in my observation. Now, some people might say, well, proportional representation will mean the end of the UK Labour Party. Well, I must say, as Labour Party deputy leader and then leader, I had real worries that it might mean the end of the New Zealand Labour Party. But, you know, look, as parties, we are capable of reinventing ourselves to operate well in whatever the system is. And we did reinvent ourselves to operate well in it. And I, for one, would not support change back again. As I say, people sometimes allege that governments under MMP, which require coalition and other arrangements, don't get much done. That's not my experience at all. You can get a great deal done. People ask, are MPs still accountable under proportional representation? Well, directly, yes, the electorate MPs are accountable. And one of the good features of MMP, which is why I think it can resonate with New Zealand and with British voters, is you do keep an electorate MP. In New Zealand, the split between electorate MPs and list MPs is roughly 50-50. That means the electorates are about twice as big as they used to be, but nonetheless not ginormous by UK standards. The list MPs, of course, the accountability is more indirect, more through the party itself and its performance. But I think it's perfectly fair to say that there is accountability under the system. In the UK, some people might say, well, haven't we had a referendum on PR and rejected it? Well, you didn't really. You had a referendum on a preferential voting system, and that's not proportional representation. Interestingly, as I said, when that was put on the list of options in the 1992 indicative referendum in New Zealand, 6% of people voted for it. So that's not what they wanted. They wanted proportional representation, and they wanted a good form of it. And MMP is quite a pure form of it. Pure in the sense that you have the two votes, one vote is for the electorate, the other for the party. And the eventual composition of the parliament mirrors the party vote, with this minor qualification, that to be represented in the New Zealand Parliament, a party must poll 5% of the vote or win one seat. If it wins one seat and say 3% of the vote, it'll bring probably 4 or 5 other MPs in. If it wins no seat and 5% of the vote, it won't bring any in. Now, of course, there has been some complaint about that over the year. Is that fair? But basically, that threshold does mitigate against perhaps the kind of proliferation you see in the Italian system or the Israeli system, where you have many very, very tiny parties. We don't get that. I think the most we've had elected in the parliament is about 7 different parties, and it's under that at the moment. So that would be my tour de table, if you like, of our experience with it. But I hope I've said enough to provoke some questions and interest. And let me conclude where I began. It's not unusual for party leaders to fear a change like this. I did. But the reality is, if there's momentum for it and the public are looking for something like this, most definitely major parties can make it work. And over time, it becomes seen as a good way of doing things.
Thank you so much, Helen. Are you able to take some questions now? And would you
Definitely
prefer to have them in thirds or one at a time? In 3 or 1 at a time?
Try 3, and that will stop me repeating myself.
Okay. Well, the first question we've got comes from Ian Mallett, and I think you've partly answered this anyway, but do you want to describe the way in which the government in New Zealand is similar to the German system, and whether or not it is different from the Scottish system, and also what arrangements do you have for local government? They have a single transferable vote for local government in Scotland.
But maybe let me answer that one then, because it's a bit technical and I'll forget the details. I think ours is quite similar to the way the German system works, which is not surprising because we modeled it precisely on the German system. And as I say, Germany also has its, its great political parties, its Christian Democrats and their barbarian allies, and the Social Democrats, a very long and proud tradition, struggling a bit in the polls at the moment, obviously. The Christian Democrats have often relied in the past on the Liberal Democrats for the majority, but they've also a number of, well, several times in recent elections had grand coalitions of Conservatives and Social Democrats. And I suppose New Zealand hasn't gone down that route. And I don't think in a way it's a very attractive route, because if the two major tendencies come together, then the opposition will form to the extremes. And you saw in the last German election, the neo-Nazis getting, 17, 18% of the vote, which is quite a scary thing for Germany itself. So while when we began, we looked more like the German system with a party in the middle kind of calling the shots, and the Greens more naturally aligning with Social Democrats, in the end, this formation of grand coalitions is not something that we have followed, and I would think it would be extremely unlikely in the New Zealand context, and unlikely in the British context, I'd suggest. The Scottish system, I'm not so familiar with, although, often looking from outside, Scotland looks a little bit like a one-party state, so it tends to deliver quite big majorities. But as I understand, it hasn't required coalitions. But here we are, 1996, 24 years ago, first MMP election, no single party majority government elected out of that at all. This might be the first time. This time it might not, but the system in a way is designed not to deliver that. At local government, we have first past the post. There might be some minor variation somewhere, but generally that's the way it's done.
Right, okay, I've got a question from Monica Threlfall, who asks, Helen, how are the list members of Parliament accountable? Is there some sort of accountability mechanism for the list MPs? And I've also got a question from Ruth Cadbury. Prior to either of the two referenda, was there any form of public engagement in considering the different options for electoral reform, and can we learn from that? And the third question is, do you think that there are, this is from James Corrie, do you think there are any legitimate alternatives to a referendum as routes to such a significant constitutional change, given that quite a lot of people in this country feel that referenda can be quite divisive?
Well, and not surprisingly, given recent experiences, both with the Scottish independence referendum and then, of course, Brexit. Look, on the public accountability of list MPs, there's no public mechanism as such. So you could say that the accountability then has to come through two other routes. One, of course, is media, and media do hold MPs to account, and should. That's the function of the fourth estate. But it's also the party that needs to hold them to account as to whether they perform or not. And you do see when parties produce their lists for an election, poor performance tend to be dumped down lists to a point where they may struggle to get elected at all. So that it's that internal mechanism that's probably the most deadly for a low performing MP. I don't see in the New Zealand context so much sort of de-ranking of people on lists, party lists, because of factions. It's more around a performance issue, or a need for certain greater demographic diversity might be another driver of it. Now, Ruth asked, what about public engagement and the options? Well, there was an electoral reform organisation in New Zealand that worked very, very hard for MMP and to sort of make the case to the public about the need for change. So the public was quite sensitised to the options, and I think the 4 options that the government put in the 1992 referendum would have been seen as 4 fair options to put. Then when MMP came out as much the preferred option from an electorate which was 85% wanting a change of system, the legislation was drawn up and went through well-considered select committee processes in the Parliament. So the public also had input and voice at that point. So I've never heard it said that there wasn't public engagement. There was a great deal of public engagement around the whole process. James asked, do you need to have a referendum to make these changes in effect? Is that what makes it legitimate? In countries like the UK and New Zealand, we are among the few in the world that don't have a written constitution as such, right? We draw on different documents and key act, whether it's Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, the Letters Patent, and of course the Electoral Act is a key constitutional document. So I think to change the Electoral Act, you do need a considered process of public consultation. And a 2-stage referendum is quite a good way to do that. Our process asked people, do you want to change? 85%, yes, please, relief, please. And then if it's going to happen, which of the options do you want? There was a clear winner out of that. Then you work up that proposal, full public engagement around that process. You go back to the public with it, and they voted for it. So that gave the change enormous legitimacy. And I think just to legislate for it in Parliament probably wouldn't give that legitimacy. A 1-stage referendum, I don't think would be sensible either.
Okay, thank you, Helen. I'll give you 3 more questions. What is there a specific role for list MPs in the system you have? That's from Nathan Mann. From Harold Emmanuel, what did the Labour Party need to do in New Zealand in order to reinvent itself? And then thirdly, there was a question I saw from Mary Southcott, which was about your own personal journey, because I think you were opposed to MMP to start off with. And what was it that made you change your mind?
So on the list MPs, the parties allocate the work that they want done. So let's say your party is in opposition. The list MPs, like the electorate MPs, will be given some kind of portfolio or spokesperson responsibility. Now, the electorate MP, of course, has an electorate to service, and the list MP often will have an office looking like a constituency office in the electorate held by another party. So I'm an electorate MP from the Labor Party, and they're probably going to be somewhere a national MP is going to put an office in my electorate and also compete for profile. For the minor parties who don't have so many MPs, they will select where they want offices. They may have MPs. They'll probably have MPs living in a range of centres. So they'll make sure that they have a shop front and the staff that they're entitled to. They may pool resources. So that's the way it works. In government, actually, to be a list MP would be a real bonus if you're a busy minister, because busy ministers have to service electorates as well as run portfolios. But I was an electorate MP throughout my career, so you do that willingly, of course. Now, how did Labor reinvent itself? Well, there's quite a change of mindset, I think, from going from being one of two broad churches to being a party on a spectrum. And as I said, in the run-up to MMP, we lost supporters and MPs to the right of us, the left of us, the eclectic of us, and we had to rethink really what would characterise the program of a social democratic party in today's world. So we had to rethink a more coherent philosophy rather than trying to accommodate a very broad range of views. And I believe the National Party went through much the same sort of process. So it's not a question of sort of dividing the electorate into two halves and, and having too broad a church. You can have something more coherent. I mean, I'm conscious as I say this that the UK does have some more diversity of representation historically than we've had. You've had the Liberal Democrats, which have been there as a centrist voice, and then you've had the nationalist parties, whether it's been SNP or the Plaid, or you've had the Ulster Unionists as a regional party, Social Democratic Labour Party in Northern Ireland, and so on. But for us, it was quite a radical change to see a broader spectrum, and we had to have a coherent philosophy within that. On my personal journey, as I say, I was extremely concerned about what the transition to MMP would mean for the Labour Party. And actually, I have to say the first election was extremely difficult because we were going into it in a difficult position anyway. Our polling wasn't good. Needless to say, if you were to be writing the rules in the UK now with Keir Starmer polling and Labour really polling quite well, I think you'd be in quite a strong position. That's unlikely to happen, I guess, for this election because you're not calling the shots on policy and referenda. But anyway, we weren't in a strong position. Our vote slumped from 1993 to 1996 as other parties did better in the proportional representation environment. But in essence, my personal journey of being opposed to it ended when the public voted for it. When the public votes for it, you stop fighting it. You say, okay, that's it. The public's decided, that's what they want, and it's my duty as a party leader to make this work constitutionally for New Zealand, and also, of course, to position the party to the best advantage in it.
Thank you. The referenda that we've had in the United Kingdom in recent years have been very emotional. Adam Page asks, was there an emotional argument to be made for constitutional change? Like we saw with most of our recent referenda, most people voted with their hearts and not with their heads. And I think we'd better finish with this question because we've got many other speakers, but I think that's a very good question to finish with, Helen.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't anything like as emotional as as the Brexit referendum, which was like an existential question, wasn't it? But it was quite hard fought. And of course, one of the key arguments was if you get MMP, the bronze medal winner will decide which of the gold and silver actually gets to form a government. So there's quite a lot around that. But, in the end, a program of government has to command a majority of parliament. And there's no point sulking if you can't get your program over the line in negotiation with the others required to make up the parliamentary majority for that. So I don't see it as the tail wagging the dog. It is a process of negotiation. there may have been a question, did I see it on screen or did I forget to deal with it earlier? The 9 weeks negotiation after the first MMP election in 1996, the public did get very sick of that and the media got sick of it. And I think the third party, New Zealand First, which was being negotiated with by both Labour and National, it probably got most of the criticism for that. But again, this was uncharted territory. We'd never had to do this before. Just one tip that came out of that. In the 9 weeks of negotiation, basically the two parties sat down with their manifestos, Labour and New Zealand First, Conservative and New Zealand First, and negotiated a program of government. Now, when National and New Zealand First went into government together, they had a program for government, which actually neither of them were totally committed to because they'd had to compromise so much on it. And in a way, the next 3 years was about that falling apart. So learning from that, when we were in a position to form a government after the 1999 election, we were on the public record as saying that we would work with the alliance, which was positioned to the left of us. And we decided that we would not have a detailed agreement around the program of government. The agreement we had with the alliance simply said that we would work together in good faith to form a strong government, and that there would be an agree to disagree mechanism should it be needed. As time went on, there weren't detailed programs I had in the other post-election agreements for government either, but sometimes you could get something a bit annoying become an absolute red line. So after the 2002 and 2005 elections, a minor party that we needed to do business with had a bee in its bonnet about cannabis law reform and specifically wrote into the agreement that the government would not move in that direction, which was incredibly frustrating. And I'm still fighting and advocating around this issue today. But then you ask yourself, are you not going to form a government because of that one issue? Well, no, because there's thousands of other issues that you want to get on with and progress. But that was irritating. But hey, that's the breaks. We had 9 years of government.